Father in heaven, we just invite your Spirit's presence. Help us and guide us and teach us. And be with each person here, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So, not everybody was here last night. And what I covered, I'm going to review, but I'm going to do it a little more quickly than I presented it last night. So, the first thing, before I actually do the review, what I'm presenting is the timeline of the Millerites in regard to Samuel Snow's letters. That's ultimately where I'm going. But to do that, I'm going to look at the chronology of the three decrees and how they fit on a reform line. And this reform line parallels the reform line of the Millerites. Now, these dates I have in the first chapter on page 8 of your notes, which is page 6 of my notes. So for Bonnie, that would be page 6. The list of rules for the biblical calendar. And these rules come from an examination of all the dates in the Bible so that we find a consistency, so that there's no contradictions. And one of the things we pointed out is that the Karaite calendar is not the correct biblical calendar. The Karaites did not follow the rules of the biblical calendar. They created their own rules, thinking that they were following the rules. And so I have that in my notes if you want to read about that, explain the difference. So there's the rabbinical calendar, which is wrong, and the Karaite calendar, which is also wrong, and then there's the biblical calendar. And the rabbinic and the Karaite calendar most of the time start at the same time. They might be a day off. It's very rare for the Karaites to start 1 month later than the rabbinic Jews. And they would never start as late as April 19th, as the biblical calendar does in 1844. So if you were using the Karaite calendar, the Karaites observed the Day of Atonement on September 23rd in 1844. They didn't observe it on October 22nd. And if they had observed it according to their rules, it would have been October 23rd. If they had, because they always look at the new moon every month. So I reviewed that, but it's in my notes. So the main thing is that I'm creating dates based upon the rules of the biblical calendar. Yes, David?
So the Karaite is always wrong?
No, the Karaite can sometimes be correct. It's just in 1844, it's not. And the Karaites use September 23rd as the Day of Atonement in 1844. Now,
the rabbinic one is always wrong?
The rabbinic one is almost always wrong. That is, it's usually a day off from the biblical calendar. Sometimes it can be very close. There's the odd year where it will match for the first 6 months or 7 months, and then it'll be off by a day or so. But most of the time I find that it's off by a day.
The biblical one is not. Where is the biblical one?
It's in the Bible. So to figure it out, you have to find, there's certain things, for instance, which I didn't go through, but we know which days are the Sabbath at the time of the Exodus. And in order to have the Sabbath fall on the right days, you have to follow specific rules for that to work. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So the rabbinic calendar would not work at the time of the Exodus, for instance. And it also doesn't work for the crucifixion of Christ, because we know Jesus was crucified on a Friday in 31 AD. The only way to have that happen is we have to discern through trial and error what the rules would have been for that to occur. And so there's other dates as well that have to fall on certain days. And in order for that to happen, we have to have these rules. Also, when we follow the correct rules, we find that Ezekiel has most of his visions on the Sabbath. If you follow other calendars, they don't fall on the Sabbath. So that's an important point, because he's going to have his visions mostly on the Sabbath, except when it's dates that something else is happening. And we also find, what we're going to find here, dealing with the dedication of the Second Temple, some interesting things regarding that. So what we did last night is we looked at the 70 years. There's 70 years for Babylon, which is in Jeremiah 25, verse 11 to 12. And at the end of that 70 years, God is going to punish Babylon. So that's when Belshazzar is killed. It's actually October 13th, 539, which is in the Jewish year 538, because the Jewish year 538 started on September 28th, 539. So when the chart says 538 for the fall of Babylon, this starts in the fall. It's the fall to fall year of 538, just as 1843 is a spring to spring year on the charts, on the 1843 chart. And we also have 70 years in Babylon. This is Jeremiah 29, verse 10 to 11, and it says that you're going to be in Babylon, and at the end of 70 years I will visit you and show my good word concerning you and causing you to return to this place. So this 70 years ends when Cyrus comes to the throne in the fall of 537. He gives his decree 6 months later in the spring of 536. So in 536, Cyrus has a decree on the 21st day of the first month, 24th day of the first month. He has his decree, and that's according to Daniel chapter 10. And then the study today is mostly on Ezra chapter 4 to 6. But if you go through from Ezra chapter 1 all through Ezra chapter 10, you actually have all the history of the three decrees. And that's basically what I'm covering. And you'll find that they built an altar. So they left. The decree happens on the 24th day of the first month. And it takes about 4 months to get to Babylon, or to Jerusalem from Babylon. They probably left a few weeks after that. They would have arrived in Jerusalem. And on the first day of the 7th month, they build an altar. And then the next year, on the 2nd month of what's called Cyrus's second year, they begin to lay the foundation of the temple. So we're going to now go from there, and we're going to look at Darius's decree. So this is my notes. And it starts here with the work of the enemy. So one thing that happens, that I mentioned last night, is that once they begin to lay the foundation of the temple in the time of Cyrus, the enemies begin at that time, who are the Samaritans, and they are the people that repopulated northern Israel under the time of Esarhaddon. And you will find that in Ezra when you read through it there. These people want to join and help building the temple, but they don't allow them to help join in building the temple because they're not Jews. And they're the ones who frustrate the Jews and keep trying to have the king stop them from rebuilding Jerusalem. And so we're going to start here in chapter 4. And I did touch on this, but I want to look at it in a bit more detail. So in chapter 4 it says, "Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the children of the captivity builded the temple unto the Lord God of Israel, then they came to Zerubbabel and to the chiefs of the fathers and said unto them, Let us build with you." So these are the Samaritans, and they don't want them to help. In verse 4 it says, "Then the people of the land weakened the hands of the people of Judah and troubled them in building, and hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus king of Persia, even unto the reign of Darius king of Persia." So in the time of Darius, they're going to start rebuilding, but in this period here, they're going to stop the building of the temple. And that's because of the work of the enemies that we see here. And in chapter 4, verse 6 and 7, it says, "And in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, wrote they unto him an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem." So who is Ahasuerus here? Okay, even in my Bible here it says Esther 1 verse 1, and that would be Xerxes, except that this isn't Xerxes, this is Cambyses. He's also called Ahasuerus in the Bible. So the Bible calls both Xerxes and Cambyses Ahasuerus. Yes?
Is it also false Smyrtus?
Nope, false Smyrtus is called Artaxerxes in the next verse. And then it says, in the days of Artaxerxes wrote Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabeel, and the rest of their companions. Ellen White tells us in Prophets and Kings, page 572, during the reign of Cambyses, the work on the temple progressed slowly, and during the reign of false Smyrtus, called Artaxerxes, in Ezra 4, verse 7, the Samaritans induced the unscrupulous impostor to issue a decree forbidding the Jews to rebuild their temple and city. So it's very clear there in the spirit of prophecy that Artaxerxes here in Ezra 4 verse 7 is not Artaxerxes Longimanus, but it is false Smyrtus. So this is talking about this work that happens from the time of Darius. Over here, we're going to have Darius, and from the time of Cyrus. So it's going to be, they start to frustrate them, right, to try to hinder them when they're building the temple. They're laying the foundation of the temple. And then also in the time of Cambyses, they do the same thing. And then in the time of false Smyrtus. And it's in the time of false Smyrtus that they actually stop building the temple. So the work on the temple ceases at that time. So this is, I mean, it's one of those things that's very disputed. There's lots of different theories about it, but the Spirit of Prophecy is very clear on it. And it actually makes the most sense when you take the time to look at it. So in chapter 4, we read those verses. Now, here's a statement, Review and Herald, January 23rd, 1908. That's page 12 of your notes and page 10 of my notes. And in this quote, Ellen White says, nearly 20 years passed by. So the question is, where is she talking from? She's actually talking from when they returned. So here we have Cyrus's decree. They come to Jerusalem. They build this altar. And then they lay the foundation of the temple. And then she's going to talk about this decree of Darius. And she's not talking about from the point of Cyrus. She's talking about from the time after they returned. And they start to build, first the altar and then the foundation. Many of the remnant who returned to Judea had fallen into a backslidden condition, and were doing no more to restore the house of God than were their brethren living elsewhere in the Medo-Persian realm. But as a result of the appeals of Haggai and Zechariah, so Haggai and Zechariah are going to begin a work here. And these two books deal with the rebuilding of the temple, the completion of the temple. So she says, but as the result of the appeals of Haggai and Zechariah, the returned exiles repented before God and labored diligently to complete the temple. The Lord blessed them, and they were greatly prospered. Their efforts were brought to the notice of Darius Hystaspes, who was the monarch ruling at that time, and he was impressed to issue a second decree fully as favorable as the one issued by Cyrus over 20 years before. So in this period, this is less than 20 years, but she's very clear that Cyrus issued a decree and Darius issues a decree over 20 years before. So this decree is issued in 536. So when is Darius's decree issued? And this is in the spring of 536. So Darius's decree would be issued when? So sometime after the spring of 516. Now, we're going to look at this in a bit more detail, but I'm going to put Darius's decree is 516. Ellen White is the only one who places more than 20 years between Cyrus's decree and Darius's. No commentators that I could find anywhere ever do such a thing. Every single commentator who believes in this basic chronology would place Darius' decree in 520 BC. At the time, Haggai and Zechariah begin their work. So they're beginning here in 520, and people just assume that the decree is issued at the time or just shortly after they commence the rebuilding of the temple. But that's an assumption that people make. Ellen White doesn't make that assumption. She places it 4 years later. And this is important because, as we're going to see, we dealt with these 70 years here, but we're going to deal with another period of 70 years. And this is something I discerned on my own without the spirit of prophecy. I figured the decree had to be in 516, and then somebody pointed out the statement in the spirit of prophecy. And that's actually when I started using Ellen White's writings for chronology. Before that, I wasn't. I was just figuring out things on my own. Because she uses spans, she doesn't give dates. She uses spans all the time. You know, something happens within about 2 years, or it's about 2 years, or it's more than this many years, or it's less than this many years. And so what I did, and one day I want to create a chart with all of Ellen White's statements and all the spans showing how they all fit into the correct chronology. Because if you deal with span chronology the way that she writes it out, it's actually very specific. You can't get it in a surface reading, right? If she gave a date, it would be easy, right? So we'd have to know when Cyrus's decree happened, and we'd have to think about all these different things. What is she talking about? So that's the way that I did it, is I looked at all this different logic, and then I looked at Ellen White's quotes and found that they agreed. So we know that Haggai and Zechariah begin their prophesying in 520, and Haggai does all of his prophesying in the year 520. Zechariah starts a little bit after Haggai, and this is on page 14 of your notes, or page 12 of mine. And Zechariah has 3 dates that he mentions specifically, and one of them is in 519 and the other one's in 518. And we're going to look at those dates because they're pretty important. Now, we also have, so that's chapter 4, that's the work of the enemies. So we're just going to skip through that, not go into details. But one of the things that I will mention is that when they go to examine the records in the time of false Smyrtus, they don't go and look for the decree. What they find is it would be called the Babylonian Chronicles, and it would just talk about all the bad things that the Jews did, and that's why they stopped it. But in chapter 5, which I don't really deal with in my notes, it talks about under the time of Darius when this opposition comes, and Darius actually searches for the actual decree. So the actual decree of Cyrus is found, but it takes a long time. So Haggai and Zechariah commence building here in 520. Zechariah starts prophesying at the end of 520. He's prophesying in 519, right, in 518. And somewhere in here, the people try to stop them from building. So then they appeal to Darius. Now it's going to take some time because they're over in Jerusalem. How long does it take to get from Jerusalem to Babylon? It takes about 4 months, right? First day of the first month, first day of the 5th month. But Darius is actually not even just in Babylon. He's down in Persia. So it's probably going to take even a bit longer for somebody to get there to send a message. And then he has to search. And we find this in chapter 5. If I can remember the exact verses here. It starts talking about this copy of the letter that Tatnai, that's in verse 6 of chapter 5. They sent this letter unto him complaining, and it says in verse 13, but in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Babylon, the same King Cyrus made a decree to build this house of God. And so they actually basically discuss or show that he found the actual decree. And there's a city that they found it in, and I can't see it here. But anyway, it was in some kind of city, and I don't see it, but it's there somewhere. You'll find it. So when they found it, it was in an unexpected place. So it must have taken some time. So by the time they then find it, so let's say it takes 6 months till they find this decree, it's still going to take time, for them to get the decree to Cyrus, and then he's going to issue a decree, and then that decree will allow them to continue building. So they're going to finish this. So this decree of Darius would have happened probably in the summer, maybe in the third month of his 6th year. We don't know, but we do know when they finished building the city. So we're going to look at that in a moment, but what I want to do is go to Zechariah. So I'm going to deal with the 70 years, the other way in which we look at this. So over here, we have Daniel's taken captive in the fall of 607. In 597, Jehoiachin, we'll just put Chin there, is taken captive. And in 586, the temple is destroyed on the 10th day of the 5th month on the Jewish calendar. And that date in 586 is the same date that the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So in both the first temple and the second temple were destroyed on the 10th day of the 5th month, the month Av. This is noted by Josephus, if you read Book 6, chapter 4 of the Wars of the Jews. He describes the destruction of the temple, and he even notes that it's on the same date that the Babylonians destroyed the temple, Solomon's temple. So this is really interesting, and I'm going to I have some interesting things later dealing with this as well. So we have this temple is destroyed, and this temple is going to be rebuilt. But let's read from Zechariah chapter 1, verse 7 and verse 12. So this here, when Haggai and Zechariah begin, is in the 2nd year of Darius that they begin prophesying. So the 2nd year of Darius is 520 BC. And in Zechariah chapter 1, verse 7 and verse 12, it says, "Upon the 24th day of the 11th month, which is the month Shebat, in the 2nd year of Darius, came the word of the Lord unto Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo the prophet, saying." So this is actually, it's the 2nd year of Darius, but it's the 11th month. And the date that month began was February 16th, 519 BC. Right? So this is 520. Remember, in 520, as I said, Haggai and Zechariah begin prophesying. Right? But really, it's for Zechariah, this is in 519 in verse 7. You'll see that in, let me see here. I know these are little niggly details. Some people don't like them. But
Is that February 16th or 26th? 16th.
February 16th, 519 BC. And let me see here. So in chapter 1, and I just didn't write this down. So, he actually starts, it says, in the 8th month, in chapter 1, verse 1, in the 8th month in the 2nd year of Darius. It doesn't say which day, right? That's when he starts prophesying. But in verse 7, he has a vision upon the 24th day of the 11th month, which is February 16th. So he actually starts prophesying in 520, but then he has a vision in February of 519. And in this vision, in verse 12, the angel says this to him. Then the angel of the Lord answered and said, O Lord of hosts, how long wilt thou not have mercy on Jerusalem, and on the cities of Judah, against which thou hast had indignation these 70 years. So if this is 586, so in 586 the temple was destroyed, and 516 is 70 years later. In 519, the beginning of 519, is it 70 years since the temple has been destroyed? No, it's not. It's not yet. It's like 666 years and 6 months or something like that the temple has now lain in ruins. Now let's go to Zechariah chapter 5, or chapter 7, pardon me, verse 1 to 5. Now this is another vision that he has, and this is in the 4th year of Darius. So this is going to be a couple years later. And it says, it came to pass in the 4th year of the king Darius that the word of the Lord came unto Zechariah in the 4th day of the 9th month, even Kislev. So this is in the 4th year, the 4th day of the 9th month, which is an important date. And then in verse 5, it says, speak unto all the people of the land and to the priests, saying, when ye fasted and mourned in the 5th and 7th month, even those 70 years, did ye at all fast unto me, even to me. So, what is this fast of the 5th and the 7th month that's being talked about? Does anybody, well, when was the temple destroyed? Is it destroyed in the 5th month in 586? So the Jews began to fast when the temple was destroyed, and they would have annually a fast in the 5th month to commemorate the fact the temple was destroyed. And in the 7th month, does anybody know what happened in the 7th month in 586? It's in 2 Kings 25:25. It says, but it came to pass in the 7th month that Ishmael the son of Nethaniah, the son of Elishama of the seed royal, came, and 10 men with him, and smote Gedaliah, that he died, and the Jews and the Chaldees that were with him at Mizpah. This is the death of Gedaliah. So Gedaliah is the governor who was put in place after Zedekiah was killed. And Gedaliah was urging the people to follow the counsel of Jeremiah, that they be submissive to the Babylonians, that the captivity would go well with them. But these Jews who were a bit zealous, they killed Gedaliah. And so they mourn a fast in the 5th month and a fast in the 7th month to commemorate those events. And when the angel says that you're fasting for 70 years, has the 70 years expired at the time the angel says this? So this date that this is given would technically be, I don't have the, what is it here? It would be, I don't have the actual date written down, but it's right at the end of 518. So it's in December of 518, almost a year and a half before the decree of Darius. So why is the angel calling this 70 years and this 70 years?
Almost 2 different 70 years.
No, it's this 70 years. This is the 70 years. The angel knows that the temple has to lie in ruin for 70 years. So when it's talking about fasting for 70 years, they haven't fasted for 70 years, but they're fasting for 70 years. Does that make sense? They're going to fast, and at the end of the 70 years, what's going to happen? The temple will be rebuilt. So the angel understands, basically it's almost 4 years before the temple is rebuilt, that this is a period of 70 years. Does that make sense? So the prophecy of why this is 70 years, why would this be 70 years? Why would the angel say it's 70 years when it's not yet 70 years? What prophecy would it be based upon? No.
That's short in righteousness.
Leviticus 26. Because this is the 4th 7 times. When the temple's destroyed here, This begins a period of 70 years, just like when Daniel's taken captive, it begins a period of 70 years. All of these periods of 70 years are all based on Leviticus 26. So the angel knows that the temple is going to lie in ruin for 70 years. And that's what he's telling Zechariah. So Zechariah knows then that the temple is going to be rebuilt in a few years. He's not saying that this is now 70 years and this is now 70 years. He's saying the temple, this is a period of 70 years and you're fasting in that period of 70 years. You haven't fasted for 70 different times yet. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's an important point because most people, when they read 70 years, what do they think? Babylonian captivity. So people read this, they think it's the same period as this, but they're not. When they read the ones in Zechariah, they think it's this. But when you read in context, this is talking about the rebuilding of the temple, and it's talking about a fasting that's going to happen for 70 years, and when that 70 years is up, the temple will be rebuilt. So it's a very important point. So then we know that, we're going to look at the next verses before I write something there. So let's go back to Ezra, and let's go to chapter 6. So in Ezra chapter 6, we have Darius' decree that the building can continue. And when we get to verse 13, we have all the work. So it says in verse 13, then Tatnai, the governor on this side of the river, Sheth-Boznai, and their companions, according to that which Darius the king had sent, so they did speedily. So they actually had to, according to the king's decree, help them. Right? They had to provide materials and so forth for them. And the elders of the Jew builded, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah, the son of Iddo. And they builded and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the commandment of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. So Ezra is writing this. Now, if we look at this carefully, Cyrus has the decree to lay the foundation of the temple, and Darius gives a decree to finish it. Why is Artaxerxes mentioned in this verse? Because this verse is dealing with events in 515 BC, as we'll see. So why is Artaxerxes mentioned? Because he's not going to be until about 50 years later.
This is talking about false witness.
Nope, it's not talking about false murders.
Streets and the roads have to be rebuilt.
But that's way later on. That's 44 BC.
Is it talking about the right Artaxerxes?
It's the right Artaxerxes. Yeah.
Because it's prophesying of Haggai.
Okay. Well, I think it's a simpler answer, but good try. So people have tried different things. But basically, it's just that Ezra is writing this much later. And Artaxerxes actually did provide some material for the furnishings of the temple. So you'll see in Artaxerxes' decree, he provides gold and silver and vessels and things that they furnish the temple. But he has actually nothing to do with the building of the temple at this time under this decree. So the temple is going to be completed here. And it's confused Adventists and all kinds of people for a long time where we would think, even though we're reading about Darius' decree, completed under Darius' decree. So it's completed about 50 years before Artaxerxes' decree. And that's just not well known. Part of the problem is Uncle Arthur's Bible story books. You know, they don't quite get all these things right. So, let's look at, continue reading in chapter 6. So we know that it's the decree of Cyrus and Darius that are specifically referred to here, but Artaxerxes' decree has a part to play later. But it's not having a part to play here because Artaxerxes is not king yet. And it says in verse 15, and this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month Adar, which is in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. So this is the 3rd day of the month Adar, which is the 12th month. Now the date on our calendar is March 12th. 515 BC. Now you can see that this is the end of the Jewish year 516. Right? So the Jewish year 516 will end on the 30th day of the 12th month. But in this case, so I could say it's the third day of the 12th month. If you actually, there's one site I use called the Torah calendar, and they would actually call it 516. Right? Because it's the Jewish year 516 based on our calendar dates. So it's a bit confusing. And most books or commentaries will say that the temple is finished in 516 BC. But technically, if we look at it, it's actually March 12th, March 12th, 515 BC. So that's the actual time it's completed. And that's the 6th year of Artaxerxes, or of Darius. So the 7th year of Darius is going to start on the first day of the first month, because Darius counts his reign spring to spring. So, basically 26, 27 days later, it's going to be the 7th year of Darius. So let's keep reading here. So something interesting happens, and we're going to deal with this in more detail when we deal with Samuel Snow's letters. But it says, so we have this dedication of the temple, and this dedication actually happens on a Sabbath. So if you look up March 12th, 515 BC, you'll find it's a Sabbath. And it makes sense that they're going to have the dedication of the temple on the Sabbath. Right? Okay. And now, since this is the 12th month, they then get ready to have the Passover. And we find in verse 19, and it says, the children of the captivity kept the Passover upon the 14th day of the first month. So after they rebuild the temple and they dedicate it, 40 days later, they have a Passover. And so that's the first Passover in the second temple. And this relationship between the dedication of the temple and the Passover that follows is very important. Now, as far as trying to put this on a reform line, I'll do this separately. So we know that we have a reform line here, and a reform line has a period of darkness, and this period of darkness is the 70 years Babylonian captivity. Right? And we talked about that there's two times of the ends in this history. That is, there's two periods that end, and both are ends of time. Right? Now, the first time of the end there is the fall of Babylon, and that parallels 1798, because in 1798 we have the Pope being taken captive. That's the fall of spiritual Babylon. But this is the fall of literal Babylon that happens in 538. And then 2 years later, Cyrus comes to the throne, within about 2 years from the fall of Babylon, and then he issues a decree. And that's also part of that time of the end. So we have two times of the end in that history of the decrees. And the darkness is always what's addressed in the reform line. So when we have a captivity, the light that's going to come is going to deal with getting out of that captivity. And this is always important. It's not often thought about, but you need to understand what the darkness is if you're going to understand what the light is. So we have an increase of light, and we said that that increase of light comes with Daniel presenting to Cyrus all these, the prophecies concerning him, and then Cyrus struggles with Satan and Christ, struggling over his mind before he makes the decision. And then on the 24th day of the first month, he issues the decree, and that's when the battle is won. Right? So we can see that there's this increase of light. Now when it comes to, so this would be the first decree. So we got Cyrus over here, I guess, because he's not here right at the end there. But we have Cyrus with the first decree, and that ends the 70 years of the captivity proper. And then we have Darius's decree, is the second decree. And then we're going to have Artaxerxes, which is my next lecture, which is the third decree. And we know that these parallel the three angels' messages. The three angels' messages end the 2300 days. The 3 decrees commence the 2300 days. And Ellen White says that all 3 decrees, Cyrus in originating, Darius in, she uses the word, what is it? Originating, affirming, and Artaxerxes in completing the specification of the prophecy for the commencement of the 70 weeks and the 2300 days. I'm kind of paraphrasing it a little bit at the end there. But she says all 3 decrees are needed. And so as Seventh-day Adventists, we've often just said, well, we're picking this decree. But she says, no, Cyrus's decree, Darius's decree, and Artaxerxes' decree, all 3 of them are involved. And that's because they're a reform line. It would be like saying all we need is the 3 angels' message in 1844, October 22nd, 1844. Well, you can't just have the 3 angels' message pop out of nowhere. You have to have the first and second angel's message. You can't have a third without a first and a second. Same with the decree. You can't have the third decree without the first and second decree. So she's giving us information to help us understand that these are a reform line. This is how the children of Israel come out of captivity. And each of these decrees ends a 7 times from Leviticus 26. And we find then that the 220 years that begin in 677 and end in 457 BC are tied together to the 2300 days to make 2520 years. So those 3 decrees take, because they're ending that period of 220 years and they're starting the period of 2300, they're just like a triple cord binding the 2 periods together. So the 2520 is implicit in understanding the Babylonian captivity and the 3 decrees. So, in looking at this reform line then, and we're looking at Darius' decree, we also know that after Darius there's Artabanus, and then there's Xerxes, right? Called Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. So here we have the story of Esther. Is that how you spell Esther? An H after the... Okay, yeah, because I thought there should be an H in there, but I didn't know where to put it. Yeah, that makes sense. So, now in the story of Esther, we have a whole bunch of things, right? There's a whole bunch of things in Esther. Tons of things that people have never noticed before until we got into this message. So one is we know that there is this... And this isn't really an in-depth study on Esther, but in the book of Esther, remember I talked about there was, with the fall of Babylon, there was this thing called the Akitu festival. And this Akitu festival starts on the first day of the first month. It's a Babylonian festival kept by the Babylonians and kept by the Persians. And it goes into the 7th month. So it parallels the feasts of Israel, right, in Judah, right? And this Akitu festival, in the time of the fall of Babylon, we have the Nabonidus Chronicle, where it's described of, would have been Belshazzar, gathering all the gods from all the cities of the realm and bringing them to Babylon for the fall festival. And it's at the fall festival, when they're worshiping the gods gold, silver, wood, and stone, that Babylon is overthrown. Right? So that's one of the ways we know it's in the fall, is because of this document. And it dates the exact date, which is the 16th day of the 7th month, which on our calendar would be October 13th, 539 BC. Now, in the book of Esther, it starts in chapter 1 with a festival, a feast. And this feast would have started on the first day of the first month, and it goes for 180 days, right? And then there's a 7-day feast, and on the 7th day of this feast, Xerxes calls Vashti to come in naked before the partiers, and she refuses. And this day is the 10th day of the 7th month. It's the Day of Atonement, because it's 187 days later, after the first day of the first month. And it's also a Sabbath, and this was recognized by the rabbis, that this is when it occurred. and that it was a Sabbath. And it's one of the ways that I know the dating is correct, because I'm using this calendar and figuring out the dates, and it falls on the correct day of the week. So it's just one of those little things. And it would also disprove the lunar Sabbatarians, because they think their Sabbaths always lie on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th. But this is the 10th day of the 7th month, and it's a Sabbath. So lunar Sabbath doesn't work. And there's lots of examples of that. But in this story we have that. And then we also have the story, of course, of Purim. And Purim is about the Sunday law, right? Yeah, Purim. Anyway, however people want to say it. So that's about the Sunday law. Now the Sunday law, how would we place this here if we're talking about this being the first, second, and third angels' messages? How do we put the story of Esther in there? Do we look at it as a story within this reform line that just happens in between? Or is it part of the second angel's message? You understand what I'm asking, right? And I think it's sometimes more complicated. People want to have these really simple, direct, every reform line is exactly the same. But if you think about it, these are like transparencies in a medical book. In a medical book, is each transparency exactly the same? They're not, otherwise it'd be useless. You have first, the bones, and then the nerves, and then the muscles, and skin, and organs, and all the different things laid down one on top of another. And this is what these reform lines do. But also within reform lines, we have little mini reform lines. And the next reform line that we're going to look at is the reform line that exists within Artaxerxes' decree itself. So we're going to look at Artaxerxes' decree. Now, it's actually a little bit involved, so I'm going to kind of just go ahead to my next lecture a little bit, and just kind of preface, make some comments about it, because it's going to take a little bit of time to go through it. But when we deal with Artaxerxes' decree, as Seventh-day Adventists, when does the decree begin? Or when does the 70 weeks and the 2300 days begin? Okay, 457. When in 457 do they begin? The fall. Okay. So is the fall very specific? Is that a specific date that the 2300 days and the 70 weeks begins? No. So for Seventh-day Adventists, all we could do is to say it must be the fall, but we didn't have a specific date for it. And we're going to look at it to see that we actually do have a specific date for when the decree goes into effect. Because it does go into effect in the fall, and it's actually over a period of time. So there isn't actually a specific date where that date, now it's in effect, and now it wasn't before. But that period of time, we can see that actually the date, the center of that period of time, is the 10th day of the 7th month. So the decree goes into effect on the 10th day of the 7th month. And to go through that in Artaxerxes' decree, I deal a little bit in my paper with scholarly arguments and the weakness of them. So if you're a Seventh-day Adventist and you're trying to prove to a skeptic or somebody who's a non-Adventist, evangelical or somebody, that 457 BC is the start of the 2300 days, you have very weak arguments when it comes to the scholarly world. One is, the vast majority of scholarship says that Artaxerxes' decree was in 458 BC and Ezra's journey was in 458 BC. The only ones who put it in 457 are Seventh-day Adventist scholars. And they will always tell you, not quite honestly, that 457 BC is an established date for the 7th year of Artaxerxes. And it's not. And we have tons of evidence to show that it's not. So to say that it's the 7th year of Artaxerxes, we have to understand why the Bible says it's the 7th year of Artaxerxes. And so the only thing I can say about that is we know exactly when Artaxerxes' 7th year began. So I'm going to do this here. So here's 458, and here's 457. And we know exactly that in the spring of 458 to to the spring of 457 is the 7th year of Artaxerxes, according to Artaxerxes' own understanding of the year of his reign. Because he understood his year of reign going from spring to spring. And we have all kinds of dated documents that are double dated. That is, they have the Egyptian calendar on them, and they have the Babylonian calendar on them. And we can date those, because the Egyptian calendar is a fixed cycle, it's not based upon the moon, we can know exactly when that date is, and so we can know when that date on the Babylonian calendar occurred, exactly which year. So there's not any dispute about it. It's as solid as can be. So we know that this is the 7th year of Artaxerxes. But as Seventh-day Adventists, we have to understand that the 7th year of Artaxerxes, according to Ezra, begins in the fall, and that this year here is the 7th year, fall to fall. So that's fall, that's spring. And to do that, we use some arguments, and they're okay arguments, and they're correct, but they're not very convincing unless you're a Seventh-day Adventist and want to believe it. But we have now, in this message, a pile of arguments that connects the events of 457 with 1844. And that would confirm that the arguments the scholars make are correct, even though they're not accepted. Does that make sense? Yes, Allison. Well, this has nothing to do with Usher. Usher's chronology, he has Artaxerxes' 7th year as being 467. So if you used Usher, you would have the wrong, you'd be off by 10 years. Yeah. So
the Bibles that have those chronology numbers?
yeah, well, when it comes to this history, it's not Usher's.
Okay.
Yeah. So Usher starts the 70 weeks in 464 with Artaxerxes' 2nd decree under Nehemiah. And there's other people who do that. So most Adventists don't know this stuff because we read Adventist literature. But yeah, if you read other people's literature, you'll find that a lot of people have these other arguments. But these arguments are pretty weak. People who follow Usher want to do this, but they ignore the fact that there's documents that we can prove that the 7th year of Artaxerxes here. But the thing is, we understand that Ezra is counting it from fall to fall. And we use the book of Nehemiah to show that. In Nehemiah chapter 1, it has a date that's in the one part of the year of the 20th year and the other part, and it crosses the fall line, and so or the spring line, so we know that it's I'd have to look at it. I can't remember the months. I know one is the Kislev in chapter 2 of Nehemiah. But anyway, the point is it shows that the 20th year goes fall to fall. Is the point that I'm trying to make. And you can see that in Nehemiah. So that's the main argument that we have for the fall to fall. Just Nehemiah does it that way, so we're going to do it that way. But we now have other ways that we can prove this that are very solid, and these are other prophecies, and these come, of course, from understanding the 2520. So if people throw out the 2520, they're actually throwing out the 2300 days in a lot of different ways that they have never imagined. So the strongest supports we have for the 2300 days come from an understanding, one, of the captivity, the 220 years that are tied to 457, but also the events that happen in 457 itself, how they're tied to 1844. So we're going to look at that in more detail. Now, the 2300 days, yes, thanks. So the 2300 days, we're going to look at when we start. We're going to start on page 19 of the notes, and we're going to deal with the end of the 2300 days. And then we're going to, so it's only a few pages, but it's going to be a lot more details that we have to go through in looking at what happens in 457 under Artaxerxes' decree. So any final questions on that? Yes?
Theodore, just on that last little part, the 7th year of Artaxerxes detailed on the bottom there.
That's fall to fall. Yeah, this is fall to fall.
Top, whose was that?
Well, this is the way that Artaxerxes counted the years of his reign. So he counts it in the spring. Ezra, though, when he's talking about the 7th year of Artaxerxes, he's counting it in the fall to fall. So that's all. He's just counting it on a civil calendar rather than counting it on a ecclesiastical calendar. That's all. And we know that Nehemiah does it. So let's just turn to Nehemiah. I got like 3 minutes. So in Nehemiah chapter 1, yes, this is it. So the words of Nehemiah, the son of Halakiah, and it came to pass in the month Kislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the palace. So this is the 8th month, or the 9th month, Kislev. So he was here in December, and he's in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. And in chapter 2, and it says, it came to pass in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before him. So this is following later, right? So if he's over here, now this is in the 20th year, so let's just do this here. So we got the year 445 and the year 444. And Nehemiah is here in the 20th year. Now, this is the way that Artaxerxes would count his reign, spring to spring. But he's counting the 20th year this way, because over here in the 9th month, he's calling it the 20th year. And in the 1st month, he's calling it the 20th year. So that means he can't be using this. 1st month's over here. Let's do this a little bit better. Right? So, see what I'm saying? So if this is the 9th month, it's the 20th year, and you come to the 1st month, it would be the 21st year according to Artaxerxes' reckoning. Right? Nisan's the beginning of the year. So that means you can't be using this, because that would be the 21st year. So he's going to the 1st month, because remember, when you count the 7th month, if you go fall to fall, it starts on the 7th. 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that would be the 20th year. So that when the 1st month is still in the 20th year, that means you're going fall to fall. That's all. Okay? So that's our main argument. That's the argument Adventists use. But it's the only argument we have. And many people dispute it. So let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful that you were here and that you can help us to understand these things. We just pray for your continued work of your Spirit upon our minds to help us to understand all the things that we are studying here this week. And I pray, Lord, that you can help us to understand these things in a simple way. Be with us now as we take a break, and may our thoughts continue to be upon spiritual things. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.